Hey friends, my name is Brad Hussey, and this is a guide to CSS flexible box layout, also known as Flexbox. What is Flexbox and how does it work? Well, CSS Flexbox, or we're just going to call it Flexbox. This is too many syllables. I run out of breath. Flexbox is a layout model in CSS that lets you create efficient, flexible, and really nice, attractive layouts, but like really easy. It gives you a lot of control over your content and how it behaves. And when you resize things, it makes sure everything is rearranged nice and works in a way that's more intuitive. It's a great tool for creating modern, responsive web designs. And one of the great things is that CSS Flexbox is basically supported across all the major browsers. So you can confidently use it. You can confidently just kind of employ it on all of your websites moving forward. So in the next little bit here, we're going to dig into what is Flexbox, how does it work, and then how do we actually use it? Now, to help us better understand how website layouts are created today, I think we need to go back in time a little bit to better understand how layouts were created in the yesteryear. People in the 90s, web designers and developers in the 90s, they were kind of the OG developers and designers, and they used tables, HTML tables, to create layouts. So literally, like cells and rows, they basically create like essentially a spreadsheet on the web and then would put your layout in the spreadsheet. I mean, it kind of makes sense. You've got your columns and your rows, and you can put like your header up here, and you can put a left column here and then put some space with a couple, columns and then some content over here. That's how layouts were created. It made sense at the time, and it fell out of favor because there are better ways to do it. CSS. Moving on to the 2000s. That's when CSS floats were more widely adopted. So their floats are a way of positioning elements on your web page. They allow you to create multiple columns and rows, and they do all the stuff that like tables did, but in a more intuitive way. It allows you to control the alignment of, if you wanted to create a main body content, float up the sidebar onto the left or to the right, things like that. When they were introduced, it made much more sense, and you can create really sophisticated layouts. Now, one of the main downsides of CSS floats is that they're kind of difficult to understand. What does a float mean? When I think of float, I think of like floating in the water. Floating, I don't really understand how that word came into play. I'm not sure. Anyway, the concept of floats are kind of difficult to understand for new designers. I know that when I first learned what a float was, floating left, float right, clear fix hack, like floats are kind of difficult with responsive design. You got to use media queries. You got to make sure that everything's floating correctly or not floating, or you clear fix. It's a bit of a mess. Also, you got to use a lot of manual calculation, like math. You got to use a lot of math. So if you didn't do so well in your high school math class, well, you're basically going to have to revisit some of those concepts because you got to do a lot of math, calculating. You got your full width of your viewport. And then if you wanted to have 60% be your body content, well, you've got 40% for your sidebar content. But what happens if you've got, 10 pixels of padding on the left and the right, and then on your body content, you have like 50 pixels or 60 pixels, then that 60 and 40 doesn't work anymore. So you got percentages and you got pixels. It can be a little bit messy. And then you resize that window just ever so slightly. And guess what? It's all broken again. So you got to do more math. And that CSS code looks really, really bad. Okay? It makes HTML tables look attractive. And that's not a good thing. Enter Flexbox. Flexing its way into web design town. Flexbox basically solves all the problems, giving you more control over how you manipulate and lay out your content, how the content behaves. You don't have to worry about calculations and math. Flexbox does all the hard work. So, how do you use Flexbox in your websites? Well, let's figure that out together. We should kind of know some core terminology around Flexbox that you'll need to be aware of. Specifically, there's a couple terms that are really going to help you to understand kind of the whole principle and concept of Flexbox. Two terms: main axis, cross axis. The main axis is the direction in which your content will flow. Okay? The cross axis is perpendicular to the main axis. So here is your main axis. here's your cross axis. So like a cross, like a literal cross. At first glance, you might assume main axis is horizontal, cross axis is vertical. But nay, one would be incorrect in that assumption. The main axis it really depends on the direction that you set your Flexbox layout to be. So it can be a row-based layout where your main axis is horizontal, or it can be, and here's the cross axis. But if you set your flex direction, which we'll get to column, then your main axis would be vertical. And now your main axis is vertical up and down, and your cross axis is horizontal. Okay? Got it? Now, a key fact to remember is that Flexbox is not a single property. Like, you don't just go Flexbox on. It's not really like that. Rather, it's an entire module. So there's a whole bunch of properties and values that you'll need to know, and I'll show you how they work in just a momento. So let's learn kind of the most common and most important properties, and then we'll get our hands dirty and kind of code some stuff up. Now, there are two categories of Flexbox properties. Okay? Properties that apply to the parent, henceforth referred to as Flex container. So it's the container that holds all of the Flex, and the properties that apply to children, henceforth referred to as Flex items. So Flex container, Flex items. The container holds items. Flex container, Flex items. Got it? Good. Let's start with the parent properties. So properties that apply to the parent Flex container. First, display. The display property controls how a container behaves when it's applied to the page. So there are two Flexbox related values that you need to know. So CSS, standard CSS practice here, you've got properties and values. So this display property, think of it like you're turning Flexbox on, like a switch. So the two values you need to know for display are flex and inline flex. Flex is the default value. So display flex, default value. It causes the Flex container to become a Flexbox. So cool. The items inside the container will then be laid out according to the Flexbox rules. And then inline flex causes the Flex container to behave like an inline box. So the items will be laid out one after another, similar to how they would be laid out if they were all in a single line. So here we have some simple markup. We have div with the class of boxes, and then 3 individual divs inside of that. The class of box behaves kind of as you'd expect. They kind of stack on top of each other in a block-based layout. And in my CSS, there's nothing remarkable going on here. But if I turn on flex, then this will behave as a flex layout. So now effectively we just have Flexbox turned on. Nothing kind of crazy turning on here. You might just think, oh, that's just kind of like inline block. I mean, it kind of acts like that, but turning on display flex on the container, on the parent container here, the Flex container, as we will call it, means that the boxes on the inside will behave like it's all now within a Flexbox. And this is kind of the default behavior. Nothing crazy here, but you'll see how this becomes much more remarkable as we move on. The next parent property is flex direction. This property defines the direction in which your content will be displayed. You can use it to create horizontal or vertical layouts, switching between the two depending on the context. So there are 4 flex direction values that you can choose from: row, column, row reverse, and column reverse. So remember when I mentioned your main axis and your cross axis? This is what determines, what's the direction, your flex direction, which will determine which way your main axis is moving. Is it moving horizontally, vertically? Is it going reverse horizontally or reverse vertically? Okay, so the row creates a row-based layout with the content displayed from left to right, as you'd expect. Column creates a column-based layout with the content displayed top to bottom. Row reverse is a row, but reversed, and column is column, but reversed. Normally, if you wanted to create these sorts of layouts, you'd have to literally move your markup move your HTML in this sort of manner. But if you use Flexbox, you can just have your content be like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can move it in reverse, up and down, left and right. Let me just show you. So very simple markup. We got div with the class of boxes, 3 child elements within there. In our CSS, very simple, we turned on display flex. And then we have our flex direction here. I commented out the other properties. We'll see what they do. So right now I have flex direction column, which means all the children elements will kind of behave in a column-like fashion. So up and down. What happens if I say column reverse? Now you'll see the boxes are 3, 2, 1 rather than 1, 2, 3. Interesting. It doesn't move the markup. So semantically, for your SEO or whatever, your content still is being read as 1, 2, 3. But if you want to reverse it for some reason, a stylistic choice or whatever, you can flip that with column reverse. Now, what if we did row? This is the default. So if you don't use flex direction, it's by default going to be flex direction row. But you can also go row reverse and it will flip that 3, 2, 1, and it's moving it to the far right side of the flex container. You can change where it is coming from. So right now it's going from the right to left. It's stuck to the right-hand side of the flex container and the boxes are reversed. You'll see eventually here, there's a property where we can make those boxes stick to the left-hand side or center or wherever we want and still be reversed. So let's set it back to column for now. Now, the next property is Flexwrap. This property determines how your content will wrap when it doesn't fit in the defined layout. You can use it to either wrap your content or overflow it. There's 3 Flexwrap values. There's no wrap. This is the default and it prevents the content from wrapping. So it will overflow the container if it doesn't fit. So it'll keep going from like left to right or up and down, wherever. It'll just keep going. You might not want to use that, but in some cases you actually want to keep that wrapping down below rather. And then wrap, this causes the content to wrap depending on the screen size. This is where responsive design comes in. And then wrap reverse. It's just wrapping, but in reverse. So let's check it out. Same markup. I just added a couple more boxes. Now in the CSS, we've got our flex container turned on with display flex. And then flex wrap, we can do flex wrap wrap. We can do flex wrap no wrap. Now, if I were to give a background to this boxes container, that is overflowing the box, the flex container. Let's do wrap reverse and it will wrap, but in reverse. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just had wrap, behaves as normal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's flex wrap. Next property is Flexflow. It's a shorthand property that basically just combines flex direction and flex wrap into a single value. You probably just want to use this. Same markup, more boxes. We got the parent flex container, display flex. Remember, these are all parent properties. We're not doing anything on the flex items yet. So we got Flexflow, all the different syntax options here. Flexflow, right now I have column, wrap, reverse. The default would be row, no wrap. There we go. You could do row, wrap. You could do row, wrap, reverse. And you could do column, wrap, reverse. You get it. Okay, now moving on with a new outfit to justify content. Justify content is a property that sets the alignment of items within a flex container. Okay, so justify content is a property that sets the alignment of items within the flex container along its main axis. Now remember, depending on which direction your main axis goes, it could be horizontal or vertical or reverse horizontal and reverse vertical, row, column, reverse row, reverse column, respectively. The justify content will set the alignment. So we have flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. So let me show you what that looks like. All right, so here we have our boxes. Right now they are set to flex and row wrap, but they're all just kind of jammed up against one another here. Now let's say you wanted that filling out the container. Well, let's justify content, go space between. Give some space in between each of the boxes. So space between is used to create equal spacing between all the items and to space them out evenly among the main axis. In between, space between is even. Now on the outside, there is no space there. It's just the normal padding from the container. If I took padding off, you'll see more realistically. So there's space between, but it goes straight to the edges. Let me make the background a little darker so you can see what I'm talking about. Space between, if I turn padding back on, you'll see it's right up against the edge of the padding and the space between is equal. So now let's try something like space evenly. So space evenly gives even space between all the items, including the outside. Let me turn off the padding here so you're not confused by this at all, or it's not giving us a false perception. So see, the space is even in and around all of the boxes along the main axis, not the cross axis. You can see there's nothing on the top and bottom. This looks like we have equal margin between all of them, but there's no margin. It's just using Flexbox to dynamically generate that. No matter what the width of the container is. If I made this like 800, it's going to still be even spacing on all sides. Okay, now we're going to do space around. Space around. Now what's happening here is that we have the space in between the flex items is equal. And then on the outside, we have half spaces from the edge of the container at the beginning and at the end. Now, let's try Flex Start. This is the default. So it's basically the same as if you didn't set anything, unless you had it set somewhere else to a different value and you wanted to reset it to Flex Start. That's when you would do that. You can see it's starting all the items. They're packed against the beginning of the main axis. Center packs them all into the middle. Makes sense? Flex End packs them all at the end of the main axis. Now, as you might imagine, depending on if the main axis is horizontal, because we have it set to Flexflow row, well, what if we wanted this to be Flexflow column? It's going to change the main axis. And let's make it a little bit higher so we're not confused here. So now what we've got is justify flex content. We got Flex End. Let's put that back at Flex Start. So there it is. What if we did center? It's going to center it. Space around, space evenly, and space between. There we go. Now, align items is the next property, which sets the alignment of the items within the flex container along the cross axis. Think of it as the counterpart to justify content, which is aligning the items along the main axis. Well, align items is aligning those items along the cross axis. We have Flex Start, Flex End, and Center, but we also have Stretch and Baseline. Okay, so let's dig into that. Okay, so here we have some boxes with some more content in each of the boxes, because in your website, you're probably not going to have the exact same amount of content in each container or div or box. So I want to show something more realistically. Also helps me illustrate this a little bit more clearly. So I have nothing turned on here other than Flexflow. We got row and wrap. Okay, so let me just make this a little bit taller. So you can see that by default, the boxes are stretched, and that's default. That's what happens in Flexbox. If I turn Flex off, then you would have the boxes in a block level element. Because I have a max width of 50, they just stack on top of each other. As soon as I turn on Flex, so display Flex, they fill out the container, they stretch, that's default, and they are kind of in a row, and that's default. I'm going to turn on row and wrap. It's not going to change anything right now because it's not overflowing the container. Let's try something with align items. Stretch is the default align items value. By turning that on, nothing is going to happen. Flex Start. This is where instead of it stretching, now I'm overriding that stretch align items value. Align items, it's going to stretch along the cross axis. That's what Flexbox does by default. Align items Flex Start packs them at the beginning of the cross axis, which in this case, because the cross axis is up and down, it's going to be packed at the top. If I align items Flex End, then it's going to pack them at the bottom. I can also align items Center, and that will put them in the center. Now you might think like, oh, what if you wanted to completely center your element in the cross and main axis? Well, we would just kind of go back to our justify content property, and we would center that too. So now we've got perfectly centered boxes. You can kind of see how this makes sense now. Instead of having to do that whole line height and then like margin left or margin top negative 50% and then do a little bit of math, we had to do this trickery just to center stuff. In Flexbox, you could literally just go align items and justify content, center, center. And there we go. It's perfectly centered no matter the height or the width or the size of the box. It doesn't matter. It's always going to be centered. It's so great. Now, what if we wanted to do Flex baseline? What if we wanted to do align items baseline? So the baseline value for the align items property, it's going to align all the items at the content's baselines. Now, baseline is the line on which a letter will typically sit. So like think back to like kindergarten class when you were learning to write the alphabet in your lined journals. If you were to write like a lowercase g, you'd start writing the G and it would sit on that line, and then the descender would descend below that baseline. But that baseline is what most of the letters sit on. So for alignitems baseline, you're trying to align your boxes in that format. Now, I haven't come across a scenario where I would use that realistically, but maybe you would. It's very hard to distinguish actually the align items baseline. So if Flex Start looks like this, if I turn that off and turn on baseline, it looks the same. There's a bit of confusion there, but if I were to change the font sizes of these things, that's when baseline really comes in, because I think what's going on here is that's the baseline from that line there. But if I were to change this content to just say all the same words here, but I changed the font sizes. So standard, stretch, Flexbox, nothing's happening. This is Flex Start right here. Now watch when I do align items baseline. Now your content is aligned on the baseline, which is right here. So they're all sitting on the same line. So that's align items baseline. The next property is align content, and this sets the alignment of the Flex container's content along the main axis. So you can use this to center the content, align it at the start, the end, equal space between, stretch it. And the values here are kind of the same. The whole normal stretch, Flex Start, and center, space between, space evenly, space around. Those are available in this as well. All right, so here we have a whole bunch of boxes in a little bit taller of a Flex container here. And I'm going to show you normal align content. It just behaves normally. There's nothing here. It's just normal behavior. Now let's go to Flex Start. This will pack all the items at the top of the container. Flex End, it will pack it all at the bottom of the container, or the end of the container, maybe not bottom, because again, depending on where the main axis is, this will be different. We can do center, and center packs it all in the center. We can do space between. We can do space evenly, and we can do space around. Makes everything have the same amount of space. Hard to see when you have such a tall container here. And then we have align content stretch, should stretch everything to fill the container. Now gap. Gap is a property that applies both to Flexbox and CSS Grid. CSS Grid is outside of the scope of this tutorial here. We'll talk about that at another time. And it controls the minimum amount of space between items. So think of this as like, instead of using margins and paddings, you can just set gap to what you want the gap between the items to be. It's pretty great and intuitive. Here we have our Flexbox, a whole bunch of boxes in a Flex container. And instead of adding margins or padding, I can just turn on gap. And I'm going to put gap 10 pixels, and it's going to put 10 pixels between all of the items. So you can do a value that will just be on the X and Y. Or you can add a second one to add like extra space on the Y axis. Now, one might think, is this the main axis and the cross axis? No, because if you already set this to column, it maintains the same. So on the X, no matter what your main or cross axis, how it's oriented, it's still going to be X and Y values. So your 10 pixels is on the X and your 30 pixels here is on the Y. So that's how that works. You can also put rims and percentages and different measurements there, but that's how that works. And so that's all of the properties for the parent Flex container. And now we're going to be moving on to the children properties that belong to the Flex items. Okay, let's do that.